Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with Watson Senior Fellows, Tom Perez and Michael Steele. I'm Susan Moffitt, the Director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. So good to have you all with us here today so we can continue our conversation. We spoke last November about the elections, and today we are going to pivot to policy. But before we dive into that conversation, let me start with some brief introductions. Right next to me is Senior Fellow Tom Perez, who serves currently as the chair of the Democratic National Committee. His public service includes serving as Secretary of Labor, as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice, and the Director of the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Human Services. He also served as a council member for the Montgomery County Council. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
And also welcome to Senior Fellow Michael Steele, who is a writer, journalist, and analyst for MSNBC. He previously served as chair of the Republican National Committee and also as lieutenant governor for the state of Maryland. He was also a partner of the law firm Dewey LaBeouf and a co-founder of the Republican Leadership Council. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We have been so pleased here at the Watson Institute to have both Michael and Tom lead study groups with our students both last semester and this semester. And they both so powerfully embody how we can be committed to public service and to the well-being of the United States and to argument based on evidence, and yet do so from very different perspectives and points of view. Thank you both for offering us such important models of civil discourse. So let's dive into our conversation here. And Michael, when you were here last time, you reminded us of the 1986 Immigration Control and Reform Act, which contained many components, several of which were border security, penalties for employers who hired undocumented workers, and a path for citizenship to undocumented individuals who'd been living in the United States for at least 5 years. And President Ronald Reagan said about the bill, and I quote, "I support this bill. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally." And so my question to both of you is, do you see amnesty as a key component of any immigration reform legislation moving forward? And why or why not?
Start with that. Well, thank you. It's good to be back. Good to see everybody. Hope everybody is doing well and survived this treacherous winter that we've had. Okay, so let's start with the truth. Amnesty is a dirty word. So anything that uses that term or smacks of elements of it in this political environment is dead on arrival in terms of any type of political discussion or resolution. That is the nature of our politics. But that doesn't mean there aren't workarounds, and there are. And there are any number of ways to do that. But you have to understand, I think, before you get to that space, is to recognize what animates a lot of the hostility towards the concept of amnesty today. That 86 legislation that Reagan supported and Republicans at the time supported was a turning point in terms of how the country would go about addressing some of the ills related to immigration. There were a lot of aspects of it that were implemented and made effective, but one critical aspect of it that was not was the border security portion. How do we know that? Well, 20 years after that particular legislation, there were 12 million new undocumented individuals in the country. And that process of failing to secure the borders as the law required in 1986 germinated the seeds that we're now seeing played out in terms of vitriolic rhetoric, building the wall, and the general view that a lot of people have, not just Republicans, not just conservatives, that we need something stronger and bigger and bolder to do. There are those in the House and the Senate who've been trying to work around the process of the amnesty question by looking at elements of immigration reform, whether it is DACA, young people who are here because their parents brought them, who were of a certain age. Certainly in terms of those who are seeking asylum. But again, keeping in mind the biggest stretch and challenge in immigration is not at our southern border. It is those who overstay their visas. It's those who come here at once legally, but then don't comply with the federal law. So there are a lot of different ways in which the body politic needs to address this, which brings me back to my point, that the idea of moving forward with amnesty per se is not going to work. That the political climate just will not tolerate the conversation. It is the same kind of rhetoric and heated rhetoric that we see around the gun issue. People have firmly taken their sides, and what I think it will take is Democrats and Republicans of a particular spirit who are willing to risk what will come at them to pick up the bill that was almost approved in the House and Senate during the Obama era on this subject, where you had some sense of the Gang of Eight had come together around this idea of beginning to put together some new building blocks on the issue. But they all got weak-kneed and lost whatever body parts they needed to lose in order to go out to the public to say what they said. We need a new generation of thinkers who come in on this issue who are willing to lose an election over it, who are willing to lose the support of those who are going to, who think that they're one thing when in fact, they represent the interests of the American people, not that small group of tribal interests that they have. So that's my view of where amnesty is right now. We can talk all day long about the wall. We can talk all day long about what the elements are. What it really requires is members in the House and the Senate who decide that they want to get serious about immigration. And the only way they begin to get serious about immigration is when you start electing people who are serious about immigration.
Immigration has historically been a bipartisan issue. You look at the '86 bill. And by the way, the '86 bill didn't go far enough for Ronald Reagan, and he actually took executive action, that dreaded executive action, in 1987 and '88 to expand protections for certain categories of immigrants that weren't covered under the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. Fast forward 10 years later. The bipartisan consensus then, I was working in the Senate for a guy named Ted Kennedy, and he worked very closely with a guy named Alan Simpson from Wyoming, and there was a bipartisan bill that ended up getting signed in 1996. Now, there were elements of the bill that Senator Kennedy didn't like. There were elements of the bill that I'm confident Senator Simpson didn't like. And yet, in the aggregate, they came together around the notion of principled compromise. The challenge today is that the party of Lincoln, which historically was the party of civil rights, is dead. It's been replaced by the party of Trump. And in the party of Trump, and he is an excommunicated member of the party of Trump, full disclosure, whether he knows it or not. And I suspect he knows it.
That's why I continue to piss them off. So.
Yeah. In the party of Trump, these things aren't allowed to be discussed. But it predated the election of Donald Trump. And it's important to get a little granular on what happened in 2013 and 2014, because it was both a failure of Republican leadership in the U.S. House, and it is an illustration of what happens when you have massive partisan gerrymandering. And that's not meant to be a partisan comment. And let me just tell you what happened. After Obama won re-election, there was an appetite in the Republican Party to finally resolve the immigration issue on a bipartisan fashion. And a bill passed the United States Senate with something like 60 some odd votes. I forgot the exact amount. It was a bipartisan bill. A lot of folks engaged. Senator McCain and others came together, and that bill passed the House. That bill passed the Senate. That bill would have given a pathway to citizenship for people who were here who were undocumented. Mm-hmm. It reflected the notion that we can be a nation of laws and we can be a nation of immigrants, because we always have been, or almost always have been. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans, there have been notable exceptions, but we have historically had moments where we understood that. So it gets to the House, and there is a fragile consensus emerging. The Speaker of the House at the time, John Boehner, hired a person on his staff who had a reputation as someone who, if you were serious about passing comprehensive immigration reform, you would hire her. And he did that. And there was an effort to move forward. And it was a fragile effort. And in the summer of 2014, when the House was considering this measure, there was a primary in the Commonwealth of Virginia. A guy named Eric Cantor, who was number 3 or so, 2 or 3 in House leadership. And
yeah, he was the majority leader.
He was so confident of his victory that he wasn't in his district on election day. His pollster, or I should probably say former pollster, had him winning the race by 20 to 30 points. So he need not be there. He lost the race by a double-digit margin. And as a result of that, a number of Republicans and he lost to a person who ran far to his right. And as a result of that, a number of Republicans who were willing to vote for something that was not their favorite bill, but they understood the Senate had passed it and it was time to do this and move on. They got scared, they got cold feet, and the bill was never brought to a vote because the Speaker would not bring it to a vote. So with all due respect, it was the Republican leadership in 2014 that refused to take this up. And that's why we didn't have immigration reform. And there were many other efforts in the lead up, all bipartisan. Usually all started in the Senate. There was an effort with Kennedy McCain in 2007. I could go through the whole history. But when you have the structure we have in the United States House, where seats are so gerrymandered that if you're a Republican, you're only concerned about a challenge to your right, and if you're a Democrat, you're all too frequently only concerned about a challenge to your left. It creates, when you factor in Citizens United and all the dark money in races, it creates a very, very difficult environment. And now you have the death of the party of Lincoln formally in the election of Donald Trump. You have the distraction, the distraction of the 2018 campaign. They didn't want to talk about health care, so every day was the caravan. And if you notice, the day after the election, they stopped talking about the caravan because that was just a distraction so people wouldn't care about health care or wouldn't think about health care. And we know what the distraction of 2020 will be. It will be caravans again, and it'll be socialism, and those will be the distractions. But unfortunately, in this environment right now, it's rather evident that it is next to impossible to get the consensus that we need on immigration reform. And that, to me, is very, very tragic because when I go to New York and I see the Statue of Liberty and I see bring us your tired, your huddled masses, compassion has always been what's made America great. And I don't know when compassion became a 4-letter word. And I did a study in Maryland when I was the labor secretary there at the behest of the governor. And we studied the contributions of immigrants in Maryland. And the upshot of that report is Maryland would be in really, really tough shape without the contribution of immigrants. And I would assert that America would be in really, really tough shape without the contribution of immigrants.
Well, and on that, let's pivot to healthcare, which you just mentioned. So when it comes to healthcare, I want it all, and I suspect that there are many others like me. I want less expensive prescription drugs, but I don't want anything to impair pharmaceutical innovation. I want healthcare, quality healthcare for all and health insurance for all, and I don't want to raise middle class taxes. And I want the costs of healthcare to be lower, but I don't want anything to impair our hospital system. So health policy experts tell me I can't have it all.
No, you can't.
That even if we were to cut out all the waste and all the bloat, there are trade-offs that we have to make, especially with the expansion of our aging population and the increasing use of technology in healthcare. So my question to both of you is, what trade-offs would you be willing to make? Thinking about where you would like healthcare reform to be in 5 years, what sorts of trade-offs do you see as acceptable? And what trade-offs do you see as unacceptable? Tom, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I guess I kind of reject the premise, Susan, that we can't have health care for all. I mean, so the rest of the world has figured this one out. And we're basically the only industrialized nation on the planet that hasn't figured this one out. And, you know, the three pillars of effective healthcare, you got quality, access, and cost. And our system is exceedingly inefficient right now as a result of a host of things. I mean, when I was on the Montgomery County Council, we passed a resolution to import our our maintenance meds for our employees from Canada. The reason we did it is because we couldn't reduce class size because our budget was being bloated by the exorbitant costs of prescription drugs. And the FDA is in my district, so they loved me. And we had a hearing where they came in and talked about all the dangers of importing drugs from Canada. And the headline in the paper the next day read, Perez to FDA, : show me the dead Canadians. I'm still looking for the dead Canadians. We have people going across the border from Vermont, sanctioned. This was back before we just got them in the mail. Going on buses, totally sanctioned to get their meds from Canada. I have 4 siblings that are all doctors. They've all laughed at the notion that you can't do this. We can do this, and part of the challenge that has prevented us, the VA uses its purchasing power to negotiate better prices, but we don't allow Medicare to do it. Why? Because the lobby came in. And this notion that it'll stifle innovation, I just categorically reject that notion. And so I can't help but reject the premise of your question. Now, I believe that healthcare should be a right for all, not a privilege for a few. And thanks to what President Obama did with the Affordable Care Act, which was a brainchild of that radically left organization, the Heritage Foundation, which said that we can use market pressures and market forces to build virtually 100% access to health care. I believe that health care can and should be a right for all. And frankly, we're about 90% of the way there because of the ACA. If states expanded Medicaid, who aren't expanding Medicaid, we would be closer to 95% of the way there. And the remaining challenges would be, relating the two questions together, immigrants who aren't currently eligible, except in some limited circumstances, for emergency Medicaid. And so I think we can get there. And I think a big part of our failure to get there is, again, another illustration. He's doing a class today on money and politics. Mm-hmm. And money and politics, the stranglehold on this debate that money in politics has, I think is one of the biggest things that prevent us from having the rational dialogue that we need to get us to truly health care for all. There's a number of different ways to get from 90 to 100%, and we're having that debate in the Democratic primary. You can try and do single payer. You can try and do the market-based approach that the Affordable Care Act embodies. You could lower the eligibility age of Medicare to 55, and we were one vote away from having accomplished that in 2009. We actually had 60 votes to do it in the Senate, and then Joe Lieberman flipped, and we were down to 59. There are a number of different ways, as long as we muster the will to do it.
Here's the irony, as I see it, going into next year. Donald Trump will be arguing to save Obamacare, and the Democrats will be arguing to undo it, as they have already begun to do. And I think I don't reject your premise, Susan. I think your premise is spot on, because the truth of the matter is, under our system, as it is currently constructed, you have to decide what you're willing to trade off in order to achieve something close to appropriate, something close to what's best for a significant majority of people. And that's where a lot of the debate has stopped, because, to your last point, the influences, the money influences, which, by the way, didn't just start with Citizens United. If we're going to be honest, which I think we should be, is that the healthcare industrial complex, anchored and supported and funded and moved by one particular industry, insurance companies, have defined and controlled our healthcare for over 2 generations. Just go back and look at every point, starting in the 1950s to Hillary's attempt in the early 1990s to Obamacare in the 2000s. Who was the only player always in the room? Were you represented in that room? Was your doctor represented in that room? Were medical device companies represented in that room? No, the only player in the room was insurance companies. They're the ones who set the market. They're the ones who are defining the space. So if you really want to have an honest discussion about health care, then everybody's got to be at the table. Everybody's got to recognize what their stake is in this. From the price of prescription drugs to the cost of a doctor's appointment to all the other ancillary pieces that go into our healthcare system. The other truth and realization is that we're not like the rest of the world. We are not Europe. We are not Canada. Our economic system is built differently. So we either have to adapt it to a new environment that we want to create, or we need to adapt it under this current plan and make it work, which there have been attempts. I agree with the chairman that Obamacare is nothing more than the first generation of the Heritage Plan from the 1990s in response to Hillary Care, as it was called at the time. All right? Mitt Romney ran away from it. Republicans ran away from it because Obama took it and tweaked it and put his name on it. But that's the core of what it is. It will be, I think, the basis to which we will return in future discussions, because it was the closest we've been able to get to of creating a space where you have a government and a private market system that come together, sort of a Medicare system and a private system. So for me, I think the future rests in the hybrid, where you as citizens have a choice. You can go into a Medicare for all type environment if that's where you want to be, or if you can afford to be in a private market, you should be allowed to be in a private market. But when a Democratic candidate coming out for president starts the conversation with, I want to shut down the private market, that makes it very difficult to have a broader conversation about health care. Because I don't want to be necessarily in a government-run system. I prefer a private market. That's my choice. If I can afford to be there, let me play there. What the hell do you care? All right? If you want to be in a system, then be in the system you want to be in. But right now, our political culture doesn't allow for either Tom's view of health care or my view of health care to come together in a way in which we both get to get a little bit of what we want. Going back to the point you made before about Ted Kennedy and Alan Simpson, who are working on immigration and other issues, come up with a bill that they both weren't that crazy about. That's the perfect bill, or as close to perfect as you're going to get. And the same is true in this space. You cannot have serious health care reform in this country unless we admit where the problems and the resistance is. And the resistance and the problems, in my estimation, rest in the space where we allow particular industries to control what we talk about and how we talk about it and who's impacted. Because no matter how you cut it up and down, you still have to pay an insurance premium to an insurance company. And that's all they give a damn about. And when you make your claim, they don't want to pay. Just had that issue. All right? And you're sitting there going, but wait a minute, the plan calls for, well, we got rid of pre-existing conditions, right? Well, so let's be honest about what we are dealing with here in terms of the kind of healthcare system we really want. Because I think we can, going to your premise, get as close as we possibly can to sort of having as much of it all for the space that I want to occupy for me and my family, and the space you want to occupy for you and your family, than we've ever been before. But it's going to take work. And again, our leaders are bought and paid for on this issue. So let's be honest about that too.
Well, I think, let me clarify something as it relates to Democrats in this, because there is, Democrats believe that health care is a right for all and not a privilege for a few. We are 90% of the way there as a result of initiatives like Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act and the Children's Health Insurance Program that were disproportionately brought to this nation by Democrats. We're having a debate now about how to get from 90 to 100%. There are some who believe that we should move to a single-payer system. There are others in this discussion who believe that we should continue to work within the framework of market forces. If you were to talk to a number of union members, for instance, across the country, they would tell you that they have bargained their health care and they want to keep their health care. So we're having a debate about how to get from 90 to 100. It's a spirited debate. Make no mistake about it, because people have their views. But there's not one person on the Democratic side of this debate who believes that if you have a pre-existing condition, you should be denied health insurance. And that is where the Republicans are at. There is a lawsuit right now that's moving up to the Fifth Circuit of the appellate court down in Texas, where they forum shopped this case because they knew the judge they were going to draw, and he's a very conservative judge, and he struck down the Affordable Care Act's protection for people with pre-existing conditions. That's exactly what they wanted to do. The Justice Department refused to defend the Affordable Care Act in court. And now it's going to go up probably all the way to the Supreme Court, because they did this deliberately in the Fifth Circuit, because it is the most conservative circuit in the country. And the person representing the U.S. House in this case is a good friend of mine, Don Verrilli, who argued the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And so, again, the one thing I just want to clarify here is Democrats all believe in the basic premise that health care is a right for all and not a privilege for a few. And we're having a discussion about how to get from 90% coverage to 100% coverage. And the big difference, and the reason we won, there are many reasons we had historic gains in 2018, but the number one issue for voters, and this wasn't just in 2018, it was in 2017 in Virginia and New Jersey and elsewhere, was health care. Because when you vote 62 times, or however many times they voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and when you're not willing to defend the Affordable Care Act's protections for people with pre-existing conditions, the contrast can't be more stark. And make no mistake about it, health care will be on the ballot again in 2020.
Just a quick clarification. The effort with respect to pre-existing conditions is wholly related to Obamacare. It has really nothing to do with the idea that Republicans don't want pre-existing conditions to be covered. This is a poor political tactic, to be honest about it, to go after Obamacare. So that's the politics of it. It's stupid, it's wrong, just like, we're going to repeal and replace, right? If you don't have a plan to come to the table with, you get burned. And we've seen that. We saw that in the early days of this administration. And I think to the extent that Democrats are out there saying, that's great that Democrats are saying, you know, we want everybody to have health care, and what's the slogan again that you were just saying about?
Healthcare is a right for all.
Oh, yeah, right.
For a few.
So that's great. That's great until you start talking specifics, because someone's got to pay for that. And how does that impact me and my bottom line? And what does that do to drive down costs of health care? What does that do, which we've not addressed at all in this country? Seriously. We've made it worse in many cases. And when you do see a downtick in health care costs, it's marginal. Did your health care go from $2,000 a month to $1,000? No. It probably went from $2,000 a month to $1,800. All right? And yeah, that's $2,000 more a year that you arguably can put in your pocket. But wouldn't it have been nice to have a little bit more than that, given all the other expenses that you have to cover as a family and as an individual? So all of these pieces matter a great deal. And healthcare is going to be one of several issues that bubble up and down over the course of this campaign season, depending on where you live. My friend here did a phenomenally good job of making that a core issue at the grassroots level in some key congressional districts where that was part of an ongoing discussion among other issues related that may or may not have been related to Trump or what was going on the GOP side. But Democrats were very effective about that. I talked about it on air at the time, applauded the chairman for it. He does not get enough credit for his singularly focusing the party's ground game narrative. Not his top game narrative, but his ground game narrative that spoke closest to what people were concerned about at a time when they were getting premium notices for the next year, starting in October of last year. All right? But you're going to be in a different cycle and a different environment when you layer on top of that presidential politics, and when you still have a development of what that discussion is going to be inside the Democratic Party, and no discussion per se on the Republican side of the aisle, right? Because Lord knows we don't want to talk about health care, right? They don't. They just don't want to talk about it. They should, but they don't. I think that's where your voice has become more important in this conversation, as we saw in 2018, in sort of helping to sort of define the space. Because from community to community, depending on the impact of health care premiums and costs and issues, it may or may not be a leading issue. And that's something that we'll watch and see how presidential campaigns carry it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one last question from me, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. And for this, I'm going to bring Ronald Reagan back into it from his 1984 radio address, where he said, yes, deficits are a problem. I've been saying so for more than a quarter century now, but the problem is not the size of the deficit, it's the size of government's claim on our economy. My question to both of you is, what do you think? Are deficits a problem? And if so, what should we do?
I would say just off the top, yes, deficits are a problem, but the bigger problem is debt, because debt is what you carry longer term. So deficits are your current situation, your current condition, and you can more quickly address those. You know, a $300 million debt, although we know it's closer to $1 trillion now because of some lame, stupid spending for a tax cut that really didn't get to where it's supposed to go. As I think a lot of people are beginning to realize as they do their tax returns for 2018. I've had more people who itemized full deductions in 2017 who are this year so frustrated they're just taking the $24,000 and calling it a day, which is ultimately what they wanted in the system. But that's not necessarily good for the country, but we can have that discussion. In terms of debt, the Republican Party used to argue that debt was a bad thing. And I've been dismayed and disappointed to hear so many capitulate on such a fundamental point about burdening future generations with enormous amount of debt, which I forget the number, Tom, maybe you remember offhand. A child born today is saddled with somewhere close to 300 or 400, or what is it? Do you remember the number?
A crap load.
It's a crap load of money that they're going to have to pay. And so, do you really want to do that? Look, there is some philosophical thought out there about deficit spending and the efficacy of that. There may be times in which you do that, national emergencies, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen it in the past. But I think in terms of the long-term fiscal health of the country, we need to not create a space where we're taking in more than we can afford to pay. And that means rebalancing how we go about paying for the bills and what those bills should be and are for the country. That means wholesale looking at what government is doing internally and externally, taking advantage of better opportunities in the private sector to sort of put some of that work out there. Some things you take back from the private sector because it's more efficient if the government does it in terms of the kinds of contracts that we're doing out in the private sector. But again, I still get back to a fundamental point that, you know, having been inside this bubble for a long time, I've seen up close and personal. We just don't have the leadership that's built to do that. They're just not ready to sit down in a serious manner and look at the nation's books and say, these are our priorities. I come from a school of thought, as a lot of us old school Republicans do, that a zero-sum approach to budgets and deficit is, or particularly tax policy, which creates that space. You have to recognize that sometimes you're not, that zero-sum attitude is not going to win the day for you. You're going to have to make some tough decisions. You're going to have to prioritize. So you may spend, you know, it's the old guns and butter. Sometimes within the moment and the economy, you need to spend more on butter. And butter is all those things that touch on the social safety net, education, infrastructure, those things that sort of help reset the economy to go forward. And you may be willing to create some debt. And you see some governors around the country saying, look, you know, I need to raise taxes for this specific purpose in order to get us to the next space, all right? Sometimes you may decide you need more on the other side of that equation, right? Where it's going to be more guns, where you're going to go for the hardcore, you know, defense, infrastructure, that kind of network, and you're going to have to make that decision. And again, you make that as a priority for the country, but you bring the country along in this, just as we do in our own families and our own homes. We kind of make these decisions about, okay, if you're going to go to Brown, this is what it's going to cost us for you to do that, and this is what we as a family are going to be willing to sacrifice and to give for that to happen. Our leaders no longer ask us as a nation to sacrifice. We didn't after 9/11. We were told to go shopping. We didn't after the economic crash. We were told to turn in our hoopties and get a new car. And neither of those two international or you know, gun kind of crises, or in the economic sort of butter crises, did our leaders ask us to sacrifice as we saw our parents and our grandparents do in World War II. And so we've kind of lost that space where this issue, we can have an economic discussion on the budgets and deficits. I think deficits and deficits are bad. Debt and deficits are bad. But I also recognize that there are times where you have to be fiscally prudent, and you may sometimes have to create something and do some things, as we saw with Reagan. Reagan spent money and created debt at the same time he sort of grew the economy. We saw, and we've talked about, and I know you've talked about, you know, a lot of the spending for the war in Iraq and so forth without paying for it, and how that added to the national burden. We now see similar situations going forward under this administration, and of course even in the Obama years. So I guess the question at the end of the day, the answer for me is, what are our priorities, and who's prepared to set those priorities? And that will determine how much debt we're willing to suffer and how much deficit we're willing to create on a fiscal basis.
I think one of the, at risk of being harsh, not to Michael, but to someone else, I think one of the biggest hypocrites I've seen in politics in the last 25 years is Paul Ryan. I've watched his lectures about fiscal restraint ad nauseum, and then they were the dog that, you know, caught the car in 2016, and suddenly they've got the House, the Senate, and the White House. And interestingly, if one thing I'll never understand is why they didn't tackle infrastructure as their first priority.
Yeah.
And here's why.
And just real quick on that point, just to be clear, President Trump did. That was what he came in, that was the first thing out of the gate that he wanted to do. He was talked off of that ledge by Paul Ryan and Reince Priebus, who wanted to push the health care narrative. But
Repeal Obamacare. That was a real winner for them.
Right. I agree, but that's just to your point.
No, we're in
you
raging
know.
agreement.
Yeah. Just so you know.
And so they couldn't do infrastructure because the only projects that they were, if you're going to do infrastructure, you got to repair bridges that you can't monetize. Some bridges you can, some roads you can, but many you can't. You got to repair pipes, flint, other things. You can't monetize that. And the only projects they were willing to do were projects that you could quote unquote pay for, which ended up being code for projects that were already going to get built because there was a private sector basis for funding them. But if I remember talking to colleagues and friends who were Lincoln Republicans back when I was a staffer, and they looked at the role of government in their small government view of government. One of the roles of government was infrastructure. That was a willing investment because they understood, you know, when you're building the interstate, you can't put the burden of that on one state. Or if one state repairs a road and the 3 states around it don't, it's not really going to work very well. But they couldn't do infrastructure because, God forbid, that would add to the deficit. And then the dog caught the car, and they had all 3 branches of government, and you see the most reckless tax cut in American history. That is burdening our children and our grandchildren. And I can't help but reflect on the irony of, again, this is another example. The party of Lincoln has died. This is why people like George Will are no longer part of this party. He was I give him credit for being consistent on fiscal restraint, and he doesn't see it here. I will note parenthetically that when Bill Clinton came into office in 1993, we had major deficits. There was a courageous bill to raise taxes that cost us the House and the Senate in 1994. And I would note parenthetically that we had surpluses when government was handed to George W. Bush. We, I believe, had a great recession when Barack Obama came into office, and we saw deficits and debt moving in the right direction, although by no means eliminated by the time he got there. And now we've just blown a hole. And I'm still waiting for that $4,000 increase that the average family was supposed to see in 2018. And so, you know, therein lies the challenge here. You could have had a bipartisan infrastructure bill, and that would have been the perfect example of something that might have increased the deficit in the short run, but would have been absolutely good for America in the short run, the medium run, and the long term, because it would have put people to work on things that mattered. It would have improved the quality of life in communities. Those are the things that used to have bipartisan support. But now, if you had a debate today on infrastructure, the reason they're not introducing an infrastructure bill from the White House, you will see one from the House. Mark my words, you will see one from the House. But the reason the White House won't do it is because they will get religion on deficits again. And it's like, wow, God bless you. I mean, that is just remarkable
better late
hypocrisy.
than never. I mean, seriously.
So, I mean, therein lies the problem, and it's a very, it's really shameless. And this, again, Paul Ryan, I end where I started. I mean, the number of lectures I watched him give in that earnest, you know, Ayn Rand perspective, that then they get the opportunity to have all 3 branches of government. They just throw it all out the window.
But, Chairman, as I recall, Barack Obama had all 3 branches of government as well. And we got shovel-ready projects that weren't really shovel-ready. There was no infrastructure bill out of the administration. And that was also a debate inside the White House between then Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, who wanted to lead with infrastructure, but the president wanted to lead with health care, which was the exact opposite. I find the irony is so complete between the two administrations. But here's the point. You keep saying that like it somehow makes a difference whether one party has all three, both chambers in the White House. My core point is it doesn't, because the behavior is the same regardless of the administration. We can wax poetic all day long of what a big difference having a Republican president and a Republican House and Senate, and a Democratic president and a Democratic House and Senate makes. Zero difference. Zero. Because the underlying politics is the same. And unless we're on, look, I get it. You're party chairman. You got to do the partisan thing. Totally with you. Been in that room. Know it well. But the truth of the matter is, the truth of the matter still remains that regardless of whether it's Barack Obama sitting at that table or Donald Trump sitting at that table, the result is going to be pretty much the same in the end. Which is why you see right now a new generation of candidates and voters emerging who are walking away from the system because they're tired of the results being the same. They recognize it doesn't change. The R and the D are interchangeable when it comes to public policy, right? Am I wrong? Because I thought that's what 2018 said. And I know that's what the feel on the street going into 2020 is saying. We don't know how it will play itself out at the end of the day. But whether it's infrastructure, whether it's health care, whether it's immigration, all the boys and girls in the playground play the same way. And the interesting dynamic I'm looking at is how much does an Ocasio-Cortez or a Tlaib or some others in this new group, by the way, the vast majority of those Democrats elected in November of last year were not Ocasio-Cortez types. They weren't these progressive socialist Democrats, whatever they call themselves. They were basically center-left. They were basically center-left. So there's this reconciling that's going on in both parties. The politics, meanwhile, stays pretty much the same. And on the table continues to sit the very things that we're sitting here talking about. Everybody wants to come in and do, I'm listening to these candidates, including some of my own who are talking about running and planning to challenge the president, some others out there. What are you going to do different? How do you do it differently if everybody in the room is playing the game the same way? And these issues don't move because they don't want them to move. They don't want them to move because there's too many other vested interests that like it the way it is. That's how come infrastructure doesn't get done through two administrations. That's how health care, even though it got done, is still largely a mess, which is why I go back to the point I started the conversation with. I think it will be the height of irony to hear Donald Trump arguing for saving Obamacare as Democrats are looking to undo it. So that's how I see it from my little chair.
I have to make two corrections. The stimulus bill was the American Recovery Act, which was passed 2009 when Barack Obama took office, prevented the Great Recession from becoming the Great Depression. My one critique of that bill is we didn't go far enough. The reason we didn't go far enough is because we didn't have the votes to go any further. We went as far as the number of votes willing to go along with it would permit.
But isn't that compromise?
You're
not complaining about that, are you?
No, I'm not. But my point, you said that there was no infrastructure bill under the Democrats. The Recovery Act, and you can
I'm sorry, how many roads did we build?
Oh,
how many
absolutely.
bridges were fixed?
I
saw a lot of signs. I didn't see a whole lot of, let me just
I-
put it this
I
way.
respectfully,
In the DMV, I don't see it.
Okay, well,
Because I drive those streets every day for the last 10 years. I didn't see a daggone thing.
And if Republicans, we didn't get one Republican vote.
I don't care how many votes you got,
and
you
so we
passed
got
the bill.
and we wish we had gotten more. The other thing that was done, and to say that nothing got done, when we had everything, people with pre-existing conditions now can keep their health insurance as a result of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act passage cost us the House and the Senate. We expended a lot of political capital as a result of that. The other side did a spectacular job of misrepresenting what the Affordable Care Act was. Death panels.
Since I led that charge, it wasn't misrepresentation.
Death panels.
No, I never uttered that word when I was
but
chairman.
Your
of the
colleagues
committee.
uttered that word.
I never uttered that word.
No, but it was
some did. Just as right now you have these debates. But I get your point.
But the point is, when we had control, what did the Democrats do in 09 and 010? We tried to make sure that everybody had access for health care. When they had control of all three branches of government, what was their signature initiative? A reckless tax cut for wealthy people and wealthy corporations. That cost them the midterm election as well because they didn't tackle health care.
But when you had control, you also made permanent the Bush tax cuts that you railed against. Obama signed that legislation.
Well,
I think that was how that played out.
Well,
right?
No, there was no. There were some tax cuts that were made permanent, and there were other tax cuts that weren't.
But the significant portion of the Bush tax cuts were made permanent by the Democratic president of the United States,
and again,
correct?
Politics is the art of the possible. You know?
Okay.
Anyway, let's move on.
This
We
is
want to hear
all
questions.
On
this
that
is all kind of
note-
making my point.
Let's take some questions from the audience.
Thank you. My question is about the politics of the federal judicial appointment process, and I don't mean just to the Supreme Court, the lower two levels also. If the leadership of the Federal Society is comprised of so-called never-Trumpers, and if President Trump doesn't like it when people don't agree with him and oppose him like that, why has President Trump outsourced the appointment process to the federal judiciary to the Federal Society?
Well, I wasn't in that meeting with the president when they discussed who was going to do it, so I'm the wrong guy to ask that question of. But I mean, what you've seen with this.
Either, so don't worry.
Well, I mean, what you've seen with this president is, I mean, he has concluded that I will genuflect on the altar of my base day in and day out. And what does my base love me for? Why can I do all these other things that no president has ever had, Republican or Democrat, has ever had the ability to say and do? Because you've gotten 2 seats on the Supreme Court. You've gotten who are, I have no doubt that the 2 newest members are prepared at the appropriate time to overturn precedents that have been well settled. And this president doing that, the far right, which is his base, which is not, which excommunicated him, will be more than willing to overlook every other characteristic of this president that is in the service of making sure we have a Supreme Court and a bench that will uphold their very, very, very far-right view of the world. That's what they've done. And I mean, I've heard from certain people who have said that they've truly believed that Donald Trump was brought to us by a higher being. I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. So, I mean, that's
I think God
the
missed
trade-off.
that meeting, but
Yeah.
that's how that happened. So here's a little bit of a backstory on that particular development. This has genesis in the fact that for probably going back to Reagan, when Reagan made the bargain with the newly minted moral majority and for the first time moved into Republican mainstream politics, social issues, which for the most part had been kept outside of the body politic of the party. In other words, it was not reflected in our platform. It was not reflected in our policy positions. We, old school Lincoln Republicans like myself, have a very libertarian view of the country's ability to make these decisions. We recognize we are not a democracy. We are a republic that take on democratic principles. What that means is each state decides for itself what works best for that state. Right? So that sort of libertarian let live attitude prevailed for, well, since our founding. That bargain was cut first time the party turns around, 1980, put the pro-life plank. As a pro-life Catholic, I appreciate that at one level, but at a political level, see the detriment that has been wrought from it. But the first time you do that, it opens up the box. Also, at the same time with that, were ongoing promises with respect in subsequent elections to undo Roe versus Wade, which was at the core of the whole debate about the court and who goes on the court. And promise after promise after promise was made. Elect me, I'll give you a Supreme Court that will do what? Overturn Roe versus Wade. Well, that never happened. It's never happened. And over the course of the next 40 plus years, that base grew tired of the lame excuses, quite frankly, the lies as they saw it. Donald Trump comes along and says, I'll do it. In fact, I'm sorry, Chairman. I got a list of names, and I'm going to follow the list. All right? So don't worry, I got your back. I got the list. My nominees will come from your choices represented by the Federalist Society. The appointment comes, George Gorsuch is appointed from the list. That moment locked in that 90% support that Donald Trump has with the Republican base. Because in the eyes of many of those voters, he's done exactly what no other president, regardless of party, has done, and that's kept his word on something so fundamental to them. That base is not moving. Point two, Judge Kavanaugh. Judge Kavanaugh wasn't on the original list. The irony here, Judge Kavanaugh was supported by and promoted by George Bush, 43. All right? And got on the secondary list. And but yet still was appointed off of that list. So that bond is not breaking. And it's for that very fundamental reason why you see the president, regardless of the behavior, the words, the tweets, has such a stranglehold on a larger portion of this country than a lot of us may want to admit. Not just far conservative Republicans, by the way. I'm sure some of you have looked at some of your friends and parents and family and relatives and gone, what the hell is your problem? Right? So he's made that fundamental connection with them, and the judicial appointments has been the means to do that and to hold that base vote there. Now, just as a quick sidebar, I think as a matter of political strategy, Democrats just got outflanked by one of the sharpest players in the box, and that's Mitch McConnell. When he went to Harry Reid and said, do not call the nuclear strike on lower level judicial appointments, because that will come back to bite you. Harry Reid ignored the warning to move the president's Obama's judicial appointments through with just a 50+1 vote, right? Nuclear strike on lower judges, not Supreme Court. That was still kept separate. And then you move around into this new space after the breakdown, and which I think was, again, problematic with Merrick Garland. That's so stuck in the craw of Democrats. It's so stuck in their craw. Rightly so. Rightly so. I thought that was an abomination of the process, the way that was handled by the Senate majority at the time. But there was a political lesson that the Democrats did not learn, in my view. And that is careful how you approach it. Because think about it this way. If they had not forced the hand on getting Gorsuch to the bench, it was going to pass. Give the Republicans that. Give it to them. He changed nothing at that time. Changed absolutely nothing. All right? But because of the politics from the ground, the pressure on the ground, they had to do something. They had to make a stand. They did. And what did McConnell do? He said, here we are. Guess we're going to have to pull the option on Supreme Court justices. Now imagine if they hadn't pushed on Gorsuch, what would have happened by the time you got around to Kavanaugh? Who would have driven that debate? Who would have controlled that outcome? The Democrats would have, because you would have needed 60 votes to confirm him. So the game of politics, in my view, I guess is how I survived, has always been long ball. And on these judicial appointments, we've gone to such a short ball game. I don't know if you would agree with this, Tom, but we've gone to such a short ball game that both parties have outdone themselves to the nation's detriment in terms of how they played the politics here.
I'll just say 2 sentences, and then we'll go to the next one. Mitch McConnell would have done this in any event. Mitch McConnell said on day 1 of Obama's presidency or thereabouts, I want him to be a one-term president. I mean, Mitch McConnell, in my judgment, is one of the darkest forces in American politics, period. And we'll go to the next question. But I had to say something.
No,
there.
that's good.
There's
No, I
nothing-
appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Hi. We have ahead of us a election. We also have a census. Why did the Democrats not consider the 2010 census in terms of allocation for the House of Representatives? Why did they allow Trump to get 70,000 votes and win the entire party, win the entire game? We are going to have citizenship as an issue in this next Census Bureau reading, and it's going to have an impact on who is going to vote or be able to vote. Yet nobody talks about us citizens and who we are, but we talk about the issues that groups have. Now,
So the question is
the
about
question is, why didn't the Democrats consider the importance of this Census Bureau in 2010 and give that up so that the Democrats, particularly the people who preceded Trump, what were they?
Tea Party?
Tea Party. Let the Tea Party take control. Now, I went to some of the meetings.
Let's go ahead to our
Yeah,
respondents here on the census.
The census occurs, as you know, every 10 years. The Tea Party election of 2010 occurred on a congressional map that was established in 2000.
Right.
And so the Tea Party, I mean, I thought I heard you say the Democrats' failures in 2010 to do something about census. I'm having trouble following your thread, with all due respect, and so I'm just.
The reapportionment is going to take place based on that 2010 census.
And the
Democrats, I worked on the census, and I observed that there wasn't much pressure from anybody about who we put out there, how we count people, et cetera, how we redraw the districts that are going to be made.
Well, there's 2 different ways. There's 2
Yeah.
different questions embodied there.
Right.
The process of counting people, I can assure you, because I was involved in that. And this is a real issue right now. You have to allocate resources in order to make sure that everybody is counted. And the notion of having everyone counted should be a bipartisan issue. Talk to Republican and Democratic mayors. They want to make sure that or Republican and Democratic governors, they want to make sure that everybody in their state is counted, because federal funding flows from that. Your number of seats in the U.S. House flows from that. So that's a big deal. What happened post-2010 was the Democrats picked a really lousy time to get their butts kicked, not only in Washington, but in state houses across the country. And I take my hat off to then Chairman Steele.
I won 763 seats.
And in this most recent cycle, we won back 396 seats.
Yeah.
But he won those seats at a remarkably good time for him and a remarkably bad time for me, because they then controlled the map drawing. And we have a case in front of the Supreme Court right now that is going to address the constitutionality
part of
of
the Maryland case
partisan.
too, right?
There's two cases
Yeah.
out of 2 different states, and I suspect the judge. I think the court will throw that out on procedural grounds. This doctrine of justiciability,
Right.
because they're going to want to avoid the merits
But
of
what
it.
about
But-
leaving in the citizenship question this time around?
Well, that is being litigated up to the Supreme Court right now. And I would think that if I was a so-called strict constructionist, that is to say, we look at the exact words in the Constitution and we apply them. So let's assume now that my role model is Justice Scalia, which it is not. Justice Scalia and people of that ilk, this should be a 9-0 decision, because the Constitution doesn't say you count every citizen every 10 years. The enumeration requirement says you count every person every 10 years, which is why every court that has ruled on this at the lower court level has said that. And I can tell you that the purported reason that the Commerce Secretary put forth, which was enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, as someone who enforced the Voting Rights Act, is just palpably laughable. And the judge so found that. And so I think if the court is being consistent, it should be literally a 9-0 decision, just as if the court is being consistent on the fake emergency stuff. The power of the purse is a very clear power.
Very clear.
And the facts of that particular case, the president asked for X dollars from Congress. Congress explicitly said you will get X minus Y. And the president said, I am spending X nonetheless. That is a perfect set of facts.
pretty much
If I'm a
sums it up.
plaintiff's lawyer, to argue that you have violated Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. I would be happy to take that case, because then I'm going to ask for attorney's fees from the federal government from that one. Sorry, I digress.
No, it's all good.
As a young person, above climate change, above the political division of this country, above the problems with infrastructure, I really worry a lot about the existential threat that automation poses in the next 2 decades to this country. And I guess I'm a little bit disappointed, because it seems like politicians are not as willing to talk about this issue, because perhaps they're not as aware of the issues or technologically informed. And given this direct ties to, I guess, income inequality and wealth inequality, which are probably like the defining issues of this time period, should, I guess, automation and inequalities be an issue that is more frequently discussed for political platforms?
Just real quick, I think the automation argument will continue to perpetuate, if not dealt with appropriately, the first 2 points on income inequality and job opportunities. If for a lot of tech-based employers, they don't need the people. They don't need the bodies in their thinking. It is cheaper for me to run the bot or to run program than it is to have a body in the room that I now have to pay health care to. I've got to pay, for dental programs and, all kinds of leave and all of that. So I think we need to have a fundamental reconfiguration of our thought around what the workforce of this country is going to look like as we move more and more into consumerism. We have moved away from manufacturing. We've moved away, as much as the President and others like to tout, manufacturing. Sorry, this is not the 1950s. And it doesn't mean that we don't do manufacturing. We just have to do it differently. We have to be smart about it. But it starts with educating a workforce that's prepared to take on those types of jobs in the future. And recognize a number of things. One, which I studied when I was Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, spent a year looking at education through the eyes of our students. So I got up at 4 a.m. to stand at a bus stop at 5 a.m. with students who were catching that bus to go to class, to go to school. And being in the classroom and listening and understanding and appreciating what their expectations were of this process called education. It's a very low expectation. They're much more clued in. Our students, in particular our younger students, are much more clued into what their opportunities are not, in line with what your question is, because they participate in this automated environment. They know how much easier it is to do it on here than to actually sit down and write it out, you know? So you have all these various pieces that our educational system, our business culture are not coming around on. And so I don't think the future holds strong hope right now in terms of really seriously addressing that divergent challenge between automation and everybody else. Not everybody's going to go to college. Not everybody should go to college. They bring other talents and skill sets to the table that we're not training them for. We're not teaching them. We're not helping them bring out as we once did many, many, many years ago. And so technology continues to push them further away from being completely involved in the workforce, being completely involved in job creation opportunities. And so for me, that's a huge dichotomy that needs to be addressed. And I think we're hell-bent on automation at the expense of people. And that could be a real problem longer term. What does your child have to look forward to if everything's done for him by a computer or a machine?
There are three analytically distinct forces that have created real pressures for workers. One is automation, the other is globalization, and the other is trade agreements. Globalization, perfect example in Rhode Island. You know, Rhode Island has a rich history, bless you, of, bless all of you, of jewelry manufacturing. That was, I believe, Governor Raimondo's dad was worked in the jewelry manufacturing industry. That is not a viable industry in virtually every corner of America anymore because of globalization. The issue of trade agreements has resulted in countries respond to trade agreements. The Maytag plant in central Illinois moved down to Mexico. The Trico wiper blade plant, where I grew up 4 miles from, worked 3 shifts when I was a kid. They moved to Mexico because that was, it was cheaper. Automation is an analytically distinct force that has the same effect for workers. And the reason I've disaggregated all three is because sometimes political leaders don't fully appreciate that there are 3 forces, or actually they do, and they are ignoring it so that you think that the cause of one thing is not actually that cause. And so when I've been to a lot of manufacturing facilities. You know, the Bethlehem Steel plant of my youth, which employed 20,000 people, has now been the Republic Steel plant of my youth, which employed thousands and thousands of people, has now been replaced by the largest solar panel manufacturing facility, I believe, in the Western Hemisphere. Solar City, now Tesla. And they have 3,000 people making less than people working there 25 years ago were making, because they've got to compete globally. And so the challenge is when you say that I'm going to bring your coal jobs back, A, that's just not happening. And by the way, the enemy is not the EPA. The enemy is natural gas, which creates the incentives not to have coal-fired power plants. But I think what we have to do is make sure we have a social compact with everybody in America. In the late 19th century, we created a social compact. And the social compact said everybody gets free K-12 education. Now, there were Luddites back then who said, why does everyone need that? You know, farmers don't need a high school degree. That was the logic. And fortunately, there were people who were forward-leaning, and that commitment to K-12 education was a linchpin of why we became a global superpower. Now, as Michael correctly points out, a high school education isn't enough. College education isn't necessarily what you need, but that's why we invested heavily when I was labor secretary in apprenticeship. That's why we have to understand that we've moved to a service economy, and that is all too frequently a low-paying set of sectors, and we should reward the people who are taking care of our loved ones instead of making them work 3 jobs. And so we have to have a fundamental restructuring of the social compact, which is premised on the notion that we need to make sure you can stay ahead of the curve, and premised on the further notion that we should reward work that adds value. If we paid people according to their worth, I think home health workers would be millionaires. Unfortunately, we don't do that.
Okay, let's take another question in the back. Here. Wait, here's the mic.
I have one comment. Thank you. I have one comment and a question. The tax cut that you referred to, Mr. Perez, for the rich, I just wanted to point out one thing, and that is that the tax cut, in my opinion, and for anybody in here paying the high taxes on the east side, was really not for the rich. I think it was designated for the middle class, even lower middle class, which is what President Trump attempted to do, because having the $10,000 limit on state and local taxes really hurt the upper middle classes. Anybody that has a house on the east side, a lot of people are paying well over $10,000 in state property tax, which is now only, the limit now is only $10,000.
And the question?
That really hurt the upper middle and little higher than that. The question is, I wonder what, Mr. Perez, you brought up the Lincoln Republicans, and our party has changed, which of course there is change. I wonder what you think about Kennedy Democrats, because the Lincoln Republicans goes back to the 1850s or so, 1860s, and the Kennedy Democrats, how would Kennedy, do you think, see the party as it's morphing, the Democrat Party, how it's morphing today into something that Kennedy was very pro-business, low taxes, pro-growth. I wonder what do you think he would think of the Democrat Party today?
Well, first of all, you know, the deduction that you referenced, the choice of that deduction to do away with, the states that were disproportionately impacted by that were blue states. Mm-hmm. And there was no coincidence that that was one that they were willing to do. So I just, you know, so Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, California, I mean, those were the states that disproportionately took on the chin that issue. And so that was, just so you know why, that was, you didn't need, you know, it wasn't difficult to figure out why they did what they did. As it relates to, I don't know if you're referring to John Kennedy or Ted Kennedy, for whom I work, but I'll just lump them all together. That what I liked about John and Ted Kennedy, and I had a privilege of working for the latter, is that they envisioned a bold America. John Kennedy challenged us to put a man on the moon. And Ted Kennedy challenged us to make sure that everybody had access to health care, and that we can do it in a way that doesn't break the bank if we're willing to make hard choices. That's why I loved working for Ted Kennedy, and that's why I have a picture of John, Ted, and Bobby on the wall of my office, because they understood that our immigrant tradition was what always made America great. And Senator Kennedy always led the charge on immigration, and he always led it together with Republicans who were of the ilk of Michael Steele. Unfortunately, I think they would both be dismayed today to see that they don't have a dance partner. And I think the reason there was such an outpouring of grief at the passing of George Herbert Walker Bush, and I was proud to work at the Justice Department as a career person under George Herbert Walker Bush. He was a man of honor. I disagreed with a lot of the things he did, but he was an American hero, and I respect him for that. And the reason there was such an outpouring of grief after the death of Bush 1 and McCain was because it really was the death of the Republican Party as we know it. And I see today and that's why he's been excommunicated, because you see the inability. I mean, civil rights, the party of Lincoln was once the party of civil rights. And we see what's happened today to basic civil rights. Ronald Reagan, I loved your question. Ronald Reagan was a proponent of immigration reform. And his only critique of the '86 bill was it didn't go far enough. Could you imagine that discussion today? I mean, he would be excommunicated from the Republican Party because there's no tolerance for that point of view in today's Republican Party. That's why Democrats did pretty well in 2018, and I think they're going to do pretty well in 2020 as long as we continue to talk about these issues that folks care about.
Just real quick, I think that John Kennedy would have a problem with emerging elements inside the Democratic Party today because they are inconsistent with the value set that he expounded as president, and certainly the policies that he supported and promoted during his time as president. I think that, particularly with respect to a lot of the fiscal issues, he would have some concern. Now, maybe, you know, that's taking John F. Kennedy then. I'm not saying he probably would have evolved over the last 50 years or 60 years. Certainly he probably would have. But I think just looking at where the politics of the Democratic Party were back at that time versus where they are today, I think that's going to be a very interesting debate that's going to get played out in this election cycle. You know, Kamala Harris will anchor down the West Coast, and Cory Booker types will anchor down the East Coast, but it will be the Amy Klobuchars and the Sherrod Browns and others who will actually be in the sweet spot to potentially win the election. All eyes are waiting for the moment, right? Which almost happened this weekend with Joe Biden's announcement, which I think fundamentally changes the nature of the game. Joe Biden of that old Kennedy style and class of Democratic politics will be interesting contrast to this new emerging voice within the party. As I like to remind folks, and it's interesting to hear sometimes the pushback on it, but I haven't been proven wrong so far, Tea Party and this democratic socialism are two sides of the same coin. They're two sides of the same coin. And I watched what happened inside my house, and I'm watching what's happening inside your house. And you and I are going to have a cup of coffee in about 4 years and go, damn. Because unless that dynamic is appreciated and appropriately checked, the conversation will get off track. And you'll be talking about the days of the old Democratic Party. And you'll be talking about an excommunicated Tom Perez. And you'll be talking about a whole lot of things that a lot of Democrats are whistling past right now. Thinking this is all going to be kumbaya. Everyone was kumbaya, and they thought they would be when they got on the stage in 2016. And Donald Trump was not playing kumbaya. Ocasio-Cortez has already come out and said, if you're not down with my Green New Deal, we're creating a list and we're coming after you. She's already threatening primaries within her own party. So be careful in looking at my side and going, because trust me, what's going on right now beneath is something that will germinate into something bigger for the Democrats, not just in 2020, but beyond. And again, it speaks to the core of what's happening with our politics right now at this moment, where those brands and ideas and policies of a Ronald Reagan, a John F. Kennedy, a George W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, and others, even a Bill Clinton, the move away from the DLC on the Democratic side of the aisle was complete with not the once but twice political humiliation of Hillary Clinton. I think that tells you exactly where the Democrats stand right now, and arguably larger scale where both parties are.
I could spend a lot of time on that, but we need to have one more question.
Yes, we have 2 minutes left, and we have a student in the back who's going to ask our last question.
So there's been some discussion about the kind of the fraying of institutional norms, particularly in regards to the nuclear option. And there is conversation among some candidates in the Democratic Party to get away with the filibuster altogether. And part of the argument is there's a whole issue of equality and representation. We're getting to a point where a third of senators represent 2/3 of the population. And there seems to be a disconnect about what's getting done and what people care about. So is it necessarily fraying of institutional norms, or do the institutions have to change to better meet the needs and the concerns of the population in the issues that they care about.
With 2 minutes left.
All right, just real quick on that. I think the latter is the key point. I think it has been the lack of interest and concern by those institutions in what's been happening in real America. All right, not just necessarily in the middle of the country, but what we've seen happening along the East Coast and the West Coasts of our country that have allowed us to become so frayed and fractured. It is not in the long-term political interest of either party to engage at such a pedestrian level of concern. All right, just isn't. And so it's just easier to kind of walk it off, which is why you have someone like Trump comes in and says, well, I got a list. I'm going to follow the list. I'm going to give you, these are the folks. You know who they are. I'm going to back them, and then does it. That's why that's so appealing, is because it's like all of a sudden, if you've been ignored and patronized and demagogued against for forever, and all of a sudden someone pays attention to you and they look at you and they start responding, and then they do that one thing that you thought no one else would do, there's an immediate response. So I think the institutions have sort of walked away from the electorate, and the electorate is largely saying, okay, we'll show you we're still here. And now the institutions are trying to play a little bit of catch up. But I think that horse is so far out the barn, it's going to be more and more difficult to do, which is why we find such a volatile space where you can have these, you know, these particular extremes on both sides kind of sort of push the political process along. I don't know, Tom.
Last
The
word.
movements that brought us the Know Nothing movement, the Chinese Exclusion Act of the early 20th century, the internment of Japanese Americans, and the McCarthy era, what they all have in common is they came to an end. This too, I think, this era, which will be studied in my judgment alongside those four other eras of infamy, will come to an end as well. And it'll come to an end for the simple reason that the most important word in a democracy is that simple two-letter word, we. And what gives me hope and optimism day in and day out is that we saw in 2018 the largest turnout in a midterm election since the Civil Rights Movement. And the energy, one of the ironic byproducts of the election of 2016 is it has awakened people to the fact that democracy cannot be a spectator sport. And both sides. I mean, turnout was off the charts on both sides. And it will be again in 2020, I predict. And that is a good thing. And when I come here to Brown, and I suspect I speak for Michael in saying this, the energy I see on this campus and the questions I get asked in my classes, including from some of the people in this room who are in the class, gives me incredible cause for hope and for optimism, because you saw participation from young people go way up in this midterm election, although, again, it went up 50%. That's the good news. The challenge is 2 and 3 millennials still didn't vote. We went from 21% to like 32 or 33%. And by the way, vast majority voted for Democratic candidates. But that's a start. But 2 and 3 are still sitting home. And so, and part of the reason they're sitting home is we don't model particularly good behavior these days. And so there is this understandable kind of throw up your arms, it doesn't matter impulse. But what we saw in 2016 and in the aftermath is it does matter. And it matters in a big way. Talk to that person who's diabetic right now who thought that her health care was stable and is now worried about it. You know, talk to the immigrant who, you know, continues to see his or her ethnicity demonized seemingly on a regular basis. Talk to our Muslim brothers and sisters. Talk to women who thought that Roe v. Wade was just well settled and don't feel that anymore. I think when we participate, and that's why, you know, if you were expecting chair throwing, I want to apologize that we didn't do that. I mean, we have some real fundamental differences of opinion on issues of importance, but what Ted Kennedy taught me and what I think his mother and others taught him was that you disagree without being disagreeable. And what we need, and that's how I think we can get back. What I loved about Ted Kennedy, I can give you 20 examples of things he did. He did a sentencing reform with Strom Thurmond. He did health care with Orrin Hatch. I mean, we did hate crimes bills with the likes of Locke Faircloth, who was to the right of Jesse Helms. We were able to do that because if you walk in and understand that we are all part of this nation, and we are indeed, it's country that we are trying to build. We the people, in order to build a more perfect union. It didn't say in order to build a more perfect Republican Party or a more perfect Democratic Party. It said a more perfect union. And I think people are just getting tired right now of watching the politics of destruction, the politics of fear. And that's why I am optimistic moving forward that we can make some progress. But only if folks participate. If folks continue to sit out, then you get what you pay for.
Well, thank you both again for modeling civil discourse for us.
Thank you.